At the 20-year class reunion, Dylan Rowe walked in with grease on his hands and an old mechanic's jacket on his back. The people who had always looked down on him laughed immediately, calling him a failure who still fixed other people's planes to pay his bills. Graham Caldwell offered to cover Dylan's dinner like a man handing coins to a stranger. Dylan said nothing. Then the ballroom door opened. Alexandra Kingswell, the CEO of North Star Aeroworks, walked in, crossed the room, stopped directly in front of Dylan and said, "Boss, the board is waiting on your decision about this deal. Stay until the end to find out why the mechanic everyone mocked was actually the one in charge." The morning of the class reunion, Dylan Rowe was not thinking about the past 20 years or the people who would be waiting inside a ballroom decorated with old photographs and paper banners. He was lying on his back beneath the port engine nacelle of a Cessna Citation XLS, his fingers tracing the housing of a pressure regulation assembly that had triggered an anomalous thermal alert 20 minutes before its scheduled inspection flight. The warning had appeared at the edge of the normal threshold, exactly the kind of reading that a less attentive technician might log as a software glitch and clear without opening the cowling. Dylan had been around engines long enough to know that anomalies at the edge of a threshold were the ones that caused accidents. He pulled the assembly free with careful, practiced movements and turned it under the overhead light until he saw the problem. A sealing ring seated at a 3-degree offset, almost invisible to the naked eye, but sufficient to generate heat under sustained pressure. Someone had installed it quickly, probably during a maintenance window when the crew was behind schedule, and no one had caught it on final sign-off. Dylan replaced the component himself, logged the finding in precise language, and initialed the correction in the margin of the flight record. The hangar around him was large, climate-controlled, and filled with the low hum of diagnostic equipment connected to 3 other aircraft in various stages of inspection. The facility belonged to North Star Aeroworks, and it sat at the edge of the Brighton Falls Regional Airport in a stretch of Ohio countryside that had not changed much in the 20 years since he had left high school. He was still wearing the same work clothes when Sadie appeared at the hangar door just past 5 in the evening, carrying a clean jacket she had retrieved from the back seat of the truck and looking at her father with the patient expression of someone who had grown up watching him. Choose a malfunctioning aircraft over nearly every other priority. She was 16, already taller than he expected every time he looked at her, and she had her mother's habit of letting a long silence do the work before she said anything. Dylan climbed out from under the wing, wiped his hands on a shop rag, and accepted the jacket without arguing. Sadie asked if he actually wanted to go, and he said yes, though she could tell from the way he said it that his reason had nothing to do with nostalgia or the need to measure himself against whatever his former classmates had become. He told her he wanted to find his old mechanical drafting teacher, Mr. Harlan, who had been the first person to explain to a 16-year-old working in a local garage that understanding why something broke was more valuable than knowing how to fix it quickly. He also wanted to return a model aircraft the class had built in the spring of his sophomore year, a small twin-engine design that Harlan had let him keep, and which Dylan had finally decided belonged back at the school where it came from. Sadie looked at the model packed in a foam-lined box near the workbench and told him that was a good reason, then told him not to stay late, then drove back to the house in her own car without making him feel guilty for either choice. Dylan locked the hangar, loaded the box into the truck, and pulled onto the highway still wearing grease he had not entirely removed from the base of his left thumb. The parking lot of the Grand Brighton Hotel was full when he arrived, and he found a spot near the back beside a landscaping truck and a catering van. He sat in the cab for a moment, not from hesitation, but because he was finishing a thought about the pressure ring he had replaced, and whether the root cause was a training gap or a procurement issue with the replacement parts that had arrived the previous month. Then he walked in. Graham Caldwell's black Escalade was parked in the fire lane near the entrance, and two men in matching blazers stood beside it with the relaxed posture of people who expected the inconvenience to be tolerated. Graham had always moved through the world as though its geography had been arranged around his convenience, and 20 years had clearly done nothing to revise that understanding. Dylan recognized the vehicle and noted it without emotion, the way he noticed things that were irrelevant to the work in front of him. Inside, the ballroom had been decorated carefully by people who cared about the occasion, with long tables arranged in a horseshoe and a projector cycling through photographs from the school's archives. Marissa Vaughn was near the entrance with a clipboard and a bright smile, greeting people as they arrived. She had organized the event herself, managing the catering contract and the hotel booking and the outreach to former classmates across 4 states, and she had thrown herself into it with the same energy she brought to everything she did publicly. When Dylan walked in, she greeted him warmly and introduced him to the 2 women beside her as someone who worked with aircraft at the local airport. It was an accurate description, and Marissa had not meant it as a diminishment. It was simply the only information she had found when she had searched his name, and she had no reason to search further. Dylan did not correct it. He found a seat near the side of the room, set the foam box on the floor beneath his chair, and accepted a glass of water from a passing server. Graham Caldwell was already at the center of the room, holding a tumbler of bourbon and explaining something to a circle of former classmates who were listening with the attentive body language of people in the presence of someone they believed to be important. Graham had not looked in Dylan's direction yet, but one of his associates had noticed the work clothes and said something low enough that only Graham heard it. Graham glanced over, studied Dylan for a fraction of a second, and then turned back to his conversation. He said something quietly to the associate, whose name was Preston, and Preston nodded once with the understanding expression of a man who had been given instructions he did not need explained twice. The program began after dinner, and Marissa had designed it thoughtfully. Each person would take 2 minutes at the microphone, say where they had ended up, and what they had learned along the way. It was a format that sounded generous but functioned, in practice, as a structured competition. Graham went fourth, and he was practiced at this particular event, having attended 3 industry dinners in the past month alone, where the expectation was that he would speak without notes and leave the room feeling impressed. He described Caldwell Aviation with precise attention to the figures that made it sound substantial. 28 aircraft in the fleet, a service network covering 6 states, contracts with 3 Fortune 500 companies, and what he called a forthcoming strategic partnership with a major aviation group that would position Caldwell as one of the largest private carrier networks in the Midwest. He did not mention that 2 of the aircraft were grounded pending repairs he had been postponing for 4 months, or that the strategic partnership he was describing was the acquisition offer he had submitted to North Star Aeroworks and was still waiting to have approved. He sat down to applause that was genuine and substantial, and he smiled at it with the ease of a man who believed the version of himself he had just described. When Marissa introduced Dylan, she kept it brief because there was not much to say based on what she had found. She described him as working in aircraft maintenance at the regional airport and raising his daughter on his own, and there was a small, polite ripple of acknowledgement from the room that carried the frequency of sympathy rather than admiration. Graham set down his tumbler with a small click and leaned forward with an expression of theatrical concern. He asked Dylan, loudly enough for the surrounding tables to hear, whether he was still working hourly and whether the night shifts at the maintenance bay were hard on the schedule now that he was doing it alone. The question was framed as consideration. Dylan heard the architecture beneath it without difficulty. Several people nearby laughed lightly, not because they were cruel, but because they were following Graham's tone, the way a room follows the lead of its most confident voice, and because 20 years of doing well makes it easy to forget that some cruelties are quiet. Dylan did not answer the question directly. He said into the microphone that he had always found that the most interesting problems were the ones other people had already decided were not worth solving. He said this without elaboration or edge, then returned the microphone to its stand and sat down. Graham leaned toward Miranda Sloan, his chief financial officer and one of the few people at the table who understood the actual state of Caldwell Aviation's balance sheet, and said something that made her look at her hands. Miranda had been in the same class as both of them, and she had spent much of the evening managing the conflict between what she knew about Graham's company and what she was expected to pretend. Graham then offered, with a generosity designed to be witnessed, to cover Dylan's portion of the dinner cost, framing it as something old friends did for each other when their paths had taken different directions. Dylan declined with a politeness that contained no apology. Graham accepted the refusal with a smile that was mostly performed for the room and partly a recalibration of some internal assessment. He had known, going into this evening, that Dylan Rowe was the mechanic at one of the facilities connected to North Star's service network. He had not known, and his research had not uncovered, that the person currently reviewing his acquisition proposal was the same man sitting across the room in a work jacket with engine grease under one fingernail. Across the table, Miranda stared at the dessert she was not eating, running through the numbers she had been running through for 6 months, knowing the arithmetic did not improve no matter how many times she recalculated it. And Dylan, without performing the knowledge, glanced at the printed promotional brochure that Graham had placed at the center of each table as a kind of ambient advertising, and recognized in one of the fleet photographs the tail registration of an aircraft that had appeared in the preliminary due diligence materials his compliance team had flagged 2 weeks earlier. It was a registration he had been asked about. It was a registration connected to a maintenance history that had been described in Keaton Briggs's preliminary report as inconsistent. Alexandra Kingswell had not planned to walk through the ballroom. She had arrived at the Grand Brighton for the North Star board session being held in the conference wing on the hotel's 3rd floor, and she had been in that room for 4 hours reviewing the final structure of the Caldwell acquisition proposal before the vote that needed to happen before midnight to satisfy the terms of the letter of intent. She had tried Dylan's phone twice without success, because Dylan silenced his phone during any gathering where he was expected to be present, a habit that was occasionally inconvenient and which he did not intend to change. The acquisition was at a decision point that required his vote in his capacity as controlling shareholder, and the board could not proceed without him. Alexandra had sent a message through 2 other channels before concluding, as she generally did when workarounds failed, that the direct approach was faster. She had been told he was in the ballroom. She went to the ballroom. She entered through the side door wearing a dark blazer, moving at the pace of someone with a specific destination, and Graham Caldwell intercepted her within 12 feet of the entrance because he recognized her immediately and because he believed with a certainty built on months of anticipation that her presence at this particular hotel on this particular evening meant the announcement was imminent. He introduced himself with the practiced warmth of someone who had rehearsed the handshake, told her he was the CEO of Caldwell Aviation, and began to describe the ways in which the partnership would benefit both organizations. Alexandra shook his hand with the efficient courtesy of someone who had met 1,000 Grahams, thanked him, and asked where Dylan Rowe was. Graham heard the name and processed it without visible reaction, though something behind his eyes shifted in the way that well-controlled people's eyes shift when information arrives that cannot yet be categorized. Alexandra had already spotted Dylan near the side wall, standing with a glass of water, and the particular stillness of someone who had been watching the room without participating in it. She walked to him directly. She said, "Boss, the board is waiting on your decision about this deal." The room was not silent in the theatrical sense. Conversations continued at other tables, but the table nearest to where Dylan stood had been close enough to hear, and the cessation of its conversation was like a stone dropped in still water. Graham stood 6 feet away and understood, in the interval between one heartbeat and the next, that the organizational chart he had been reading for the past 8 months had contained a gap his research had not filled. Alexandra turned to the room without staging it, and, because several people were now visibly confused, she provided a single factual sentence. Dylan Rowe was the founder and executive chairman of North Star Aeroworks, holding controlling interest through Rowe Aviation Trust. She said it with the neutrality of someone identifying a fact that had always been available to anyone who looked for it. The table nearest the door, where 3 of Graham's loudest supporters had been laughing about Dylan's dinner clothes 40 minutes earlier, went through a visible recalibration that was almost physical. A collective shift of posture that contained multitudes of retrospective embarrassment. 2 people moved immediately toward Dylan with the intention of reintroducing themselves. Dylan did not move toward them. He asked Alexandra whether Keaton's final safety review had come back. She said it had, and that there were findings he needed to see before any vote could responsibly proceed. Dylan turned to face the room, not to address it, but because Graham was now standing directly in front of him, and because the conversation that was about to happen deserved to be conducted in the open rather than managed privately. He said, clearly enough for the adjacent tables to hear, that 11 aircraft in the Caldwell fleet had maintenance records that did not correspond to the physical condition of the components Keaton's team had inspected, and that no acquisition vote could be held until those discrepancies were resolved. Graham's expression passed through 3 states in less than 2 seconds before settling on something that looked like indignation. Graham's pivot was immediate, and it was the particular kind of pivot that people who have built their self-image on social dominance always attempt when that dominance is suddenly inverted. He did not defend the maintenance records. He questioned the motive. He told the room that Dylan had known exactly who was being reviewed when he joined the process, that the entire investigation had been a performance designed to humiliate a former classmate in front of the people from their shared past, and that what they were watching was not a business decision but a personal revenge conducted through corporate machinery. He said this with enough conviction and enough fluency that several people in the room who did not know Dylan or the acquisition process found themselves nodding, because it was a coherent narrative, and it answered the discomfort of the previous 15 minutes with a story that redistributed the moral weight. A few classmates who had laughed at Dylan's expense earlier in the evening found that this version of events was more comfortable than the alternative, which required them to examine what their laughter had meant. Dylan let Graham finish. He did not raise his voice. He explained that his name had not appeared in any stage of the preliminary review process. Keaton Briggs, an employee with no personal history with anyone in the room, had conducted the inspection with a third-party team operating under standard aviation compliance protocol. Dylan's name had appeared only on the final vote roster, as controlling shareholder, because that was the only role he held in the acquisition process. Alexandra confirmed this without embellishment. She noted that the findings had been submitted to the board before anyone in that room had known. Dylan was the person scheduled to cast a vote. Graham then changed approaches. He told Dylan that the severity of the maintenance issues had been overstated by people who did not understand the operational context of a regional carrier, that the documentation gaps were administrative artifacts generated by a data entry system that had been updated 3 times in the past 18 months, and that the only practical outcome of refusing the acquisition was the loss of employment for more than 200 workers whose livelihoods depended on the deal closing. He said this last part loudly, and with the rhetorical weight of someone who had calculated that the well-being of 200 unnamed people was the heaviest counter-argument available. Dylan asked, without sarcasm, why protecting those employees required Northstar to simultaneously absorb the undisclosed liabilities, the falsified documentation, and the debt structures that Graham had constructed using company assets as collateral for personal loans. He asked this as a genuine question. He was not performing the question for the room. He was asking it because it was the question that defined the actual shape of the disagreement, and Graham did not answer it because it did not have an answer that served him. Miranda Sloane, at the adjacent table, felt the particular cold that comes from recognizing that the thing you have been dreading has arrived and is already underway. Her name appeared on a significant portion of the financial filings that the third-party auditors were going to examine. Graham had not, in any of the conversations they had shared over the past 3 months, mentioned that his plan included ensuring she would be the one accountable for the numbers she had been instructed to assemble. Dylan agreed to go upstairs and hear the full presentation. He did not agree to continue the conversation in the ballroom, and he made this clear by simply moving toward the door with the unhurried finality of someone who had already made the important decision and was now moving through the procedural steps required to formalize it. Before he reached the hallway, his phone showed a single text notification from Preston, sent to Graham but forwarded by accident, containing an instruction to access the digital maintenance file for aircraft registration CA-17 and initiate a record purge. The story of how Dylan Rowe came to own a majority stake in a national aerospace company was not something that Marissa Vaughn had ever thought to search for, because the outline of it, the version she had assembled from public information, seemed to end at a job title printed on a maintenance technician's certification card. What she learned over the following hour, in fragments from Alexandra and from things she had heard without understanding over the years, was a different kind of story than the ones usually told at reunions. Dylan had left high school without the money to attend a 4-year engineering program, so he had done the engineering program at night while working a maintenance job during the day, accumulating the credentials in pieces over 5 years while living in a small apartment and paying off the educational debt in installments that required him to track every expense with the precision he applied to a maintenance log. Rebecca, whom he had met through a mutual contact in the aviation training circuit, had come from a similar background and brought complementary skills. She understood logistics and organizational structure in a way that translated directly to building the kind of company operations that kept a small firm alive past its 3rd year. Together they had developed North Star Pulse, a diagnostic system that used vibration analysis algorithms to identify engine anomalies before they registered on conventional monitoring equipment. The system was not an abstract innovation. It grew directly from Dylan's years of listening to engines and noticing the difference between the sounds that logs recorded and the sounds that preceded the failures logs described. They had taken the system to established carriers first, presenting it to procurement departments and maintenance directors, who were politely dismissive in the way that large organizations are dismissive of technology they did not originate internally, particularly when that technology comes from a young mechanic who works in a rented space in the corner of a regional airfield. The rejections had been uniform enough that Dylan had revised his approach entirely and built a demonstration using 3 aircraft that clients had already classified as economically unviable for further maintenance investment. North Star Pulse identified 2 faults in those 3 aircraft that had not appeared in the standard diagnostic runs. Both faults were confirmed by physical inspection. Everett Blackwood, who had heard about the demonstration through an industry contact, came to the hangar unannounced on a Thursday morning and spent 4 hours asking Dylan technical questions that Dylan answered without selling. Everett invested. He was explicit about one condition: he wanted a return on capital, not a seat at the decisions table. Dylan had been equally explicit about the terms he would accept. The technology would not be licensed in configurations that reduced maintenance staffing, because the diagnostic system was designed to support the human technicians who used it, not to replace the professional judgment that could not be coded into an algorithm. The company had grown from 1 hangar to 17 state operations, not because Dylan had made the kind of strategic decisions that business schools use as case studies, but because the technology worked and because he had refused to compromise the standard that made it work. After Rebecca died, he had given Alexandra the operational authority she needed to run the company, and he had remained present in the engineering work because he believed, and had stated clearly to the board on more than one occasion, that a technical company whose leadership had lost contact with the physical act of technical work was a company that had already begun to drift from the thing that made it worth leading. Marissa, listening to this, said nothing for a long moment. Then she said that she had watched Graham mock Dylan in front of 60 people and had not interrupted because she had not wanted to disturb the evening's dynamic, and she said it with the quiet shame of someone recognizing that a passive decision is still a decision. Alexandra did not reassure her. She said that the recording of the evening's events would be relevant to the proceedings upstairs and asked whether Marissa would be willing to provide it. Marissa said she would. In the conference room on the third floor, Keaton was finishing his presentation to the board, working through a list of findings that had accumulated from 6 weeks of inspections and document cross-referencing. Serial numbers for identical components appeared on multiple aircraft simultaneously, indicating that a single part had been logged as serviced across several aircraft without leaving the shelf. Maintenance intervals showed completion times shorter than the operations physically required. Technician signatures appeared on records logged on dates when the corresponding technicians had been on scheduled leave. Inspections had been backdated. Supplier invoices had been marked up above market rate in a pattern consistent with payments to a vendor that a preliminary financial review had connected to a company registered under the name of Graham Caldwell's first cousin. One of the aircraft carrying these anomalies was CA-17, a Hawker 800 registered to Caldwell's Executive Charter Division and scheduled to carry a client group to Pittsburgh the following morning at 7:45. Dillon's formal request to ground 11 aircraft in the Caldwell fleet was filed through Northstar's compliance system at 11:17 that evening, and it was accurate and specific. Each aircraft was identified by registration. Each discrepancy was cited with a document reference number, and the safety basis for each grounding request was described in the technical language of aviation maintenance regulation. Graham's counter-argument, delivered by phone to 2 board members he had cultivated over the previous year, was that the request was an overreach generated by personal bias, and that the same findings could have been resolved through a standard corrective action process without halting revenue-generating operations. He used the word disproportionate 4 times in the space of 30 minutes. The board member who had been most sympathetic to Graham's position asked Alexandra whether Dillon's prior relationship with Graham constituted a conflict of interest that should remove him from the compliance decision. Alexandra noted that Dillon had already recused himself from the acquisition vote. The safety grounding was a separate matter with a separate legal basis. These were not the same question. While this exchange was taking place in the conference room, Graham was on the phone with his fleet operations manager, instructing him to move CA-17 to the Dayton facility under a maintenance transfer authorization that would technically remove it from the jurisdiction of Northstar's ongoing review. The operations manager hesitated. Caleb Stroud, who was in the adjacent office and heard the conversation through a partition wall, did not hesitate. He called the number Dillon had given him 3 weeks earlier, when they had spoken briefly, after Caleb had submitted an internal report about uncertified components that had been dismissed by Caldwell's compliance manager without documentation of the dismissal. Dillon returned to the Northstar hangar at 12:40 in the morning, not because the hour required it, but because he wanted to run the raw vibration data from CA-17 through the current version of Northstar Pulse himself, using the source data rather than the processed summaries that had appeared in Keaton's report. What he found in that data was a harmonic signature in the left engine's turbine assembly that matched, within a margin of 3%, a signature he had recorded during a bench test 8 years earlier on a component that had subsequently failed at altitude during a controlled test flight. The test flight had been unmanned. The result had been a complete engine seizure at 12,000 feet. Dillon initiated a direct communication with the regional airport's flight operations coordinator at 1:15 in the morning, flagged the specific aircraft registration, and submitted the vibration data as supporting documentation for an immediate operational hold. The coordinator, a woman named Rebecca Sloan, who shared only a surname with Dillon's wife, and whose professional instincts had been formed by 2 decades of interpreting exactly this kind of late-night technical submission, placed the hold without waiting for morning. CA-17 remained on the ground. When Caleb and a North Star technician opened the left engine's turbine housing 6 hours later, they found a component that had been repainted, refinished, and restamped with a false serial number that matched a new component on the procurement invoice but corresponded in physical form and wear pattern to a part that had been removed from service and marked for disposal 2 years earlier. This was no longer a paperwork anomaly. Sadie called her father at 7 in the morning while he was still at the facility, and she asked him directly whether he was refusing the acquisition because of what had happened in the ballroom or because of the aircraft. He told her both of those things were real, but only one of them was the reason. He told her he would be glad to protect the jobs of people who had stayed silent in a room where someone was being mocked, if protecting them meant keeping them off a plane with a counterfeit turbine component. She was quiet for a moment and then told him she understood the difference, and she said it in a way that indicated she had already understood it before she called, and was asking because she wanted to hear him say it clearly rather than leave it implied. That afternoon, Graham posted a recording from the ballroom to 3 industry media contacts, with a caption describing it as evidence that a major aviation executive had used a personal grievance to initiate a corporate takeover attempt. The clip he provided had been trimmed at both ends. It began after Alexandra had identified Dillon to the room and ended before Dillon had articulated the technical basis for the grounding request. In its trimmed form, it showed a man who had just been publicly identified as powerful telling a former classmate that his aircraft records were unacceptable. The coverage that followed was neither catastrophic nor irrelevant. 2 industry publications ran versions of the story based on the trimmed recording, describing a pattern in which wealthy executives used regulatory mechanisms as leverage in personal disputes. A reporter called North Star's communications office and was given a statement that confirmed Dillon had recused himself from the acquisition vote, that the grounding order had been issued through standard safety channels, and that the findings supporting the order were available for review by the relevant regulatory bodies. The statement did not mention the turbine component. 3 members of North Star's board sent messages to Alexandra suggesting that Dillon's public profile was becoming a liability and that a temporary transition of the chairman title might reduce the reputational exposure while the situation resolved. Dillon's response when Alexandra relayed the suggestion was to authorize a complete external audit of the Caldwell acquisition process and to make the audit findings available to both the regulatory body overseeing commercial aviation maintenance standards and the financial authority responsible for securities compliance. He did not engage with the media directly, and he did not deploy any of the legal or communications infrastructure available to someone in his position. Marissa, who had attended the evening with a clipboard and a commitment to making people feel welcome, provided the complete unedited recording to the auditors without being asked twice. Miranda Sloan, who had spent a sleepless night reviewing the document Graham had sent her at 2 in the morning, a document that described the financial irregularities in the Caldwell books as the product of miscommunications within the finance department, and that contained a signature block waiting for her initials. Understood with sufficient clarity that the document existed for one purpose. She called the outside legal counsels, whose name appeared in a North Star filing she had cross-referenced 3 months earlier, not knowing at the time she would need it. Caleb had already submitted his personal copies of the original maintenance documentation. Those copies showed a date 8 months earlier on which Graham Caldwell had received a written notification from the procurement office identifying the suspect component supplier and had responded in writing with an instruction to continue purchasing from that supplier and to update the approval records accordingly. He had known for 8 months, and he had continued to schedule revenue flights on aircraft carrying components sourced from an uncertified vendor while simultaneously preparing those same aircraft for evaluation inspection intended to support a sale price reflecting a fleet in compliant operational condition. The auditor's preliminary findings reached the board within 72 hours. The picture that emerged was not complicated. It had the clean, ugly lines of a fraud that had grown from a series of individually manageable decisions into something that required active concealment. Graham had secured personal loans totaling approximately $14 million against Caldwell Aviation's fleet assets without disclosing those encumbrances to the company's minority shareholders. The acquisition structure he had proposed would have used the sale proceeds to retire those personal loans before distributing any value to other stakeholders. He had planned to retain ownership of the component supply company through a holding structure that would have continued to sell uncertified parts to the acquired fleet, now operating under the North Star name and carrying North Star's safety certifications. He had intended to receive a $38 million sale bonus under a clause in his employment agreement triggered by a change of control transaction. He had planned to recommend the closure of 2 regional maintenance facilities within 6 months of the acquisition, eliminating the positions held by Caleb and the technicians who had been most vocal about the component concerns. He had prepared a set of documents attributing the financial irregularities to decisions made by the finance department, and those documents were designed to place Miranda's name at the center of the liability. Miranda had provided the auditors with the email chain showing that each of the decisions attributed to her department had originated in written instructions from Graham. The minority shareholders of Caldwell Aviation, when they understood the actual structure of what they had been participating in, called an emergency session. Graham arrived at that session having been told by his attorney that the agenda was procedural. It was not procedural. Dillon presented the findings in that session without theatrics and without revisiting the ballroom or the things that had been said there. He presented the maintenance records and the restoration of the counterfeit component and the vibration data and the supplier invoices and the personal loan encumbrances and the email from 8 months earlier. He presented the full unedited recording from the ballroom, not to establish that Graham had been unkind, but to establish the timeline of events and to document that Dillon's involvement in the acquisition review had preceded the reunion and was not a response to it. Caleb confirmed the technical findings. Miranda confirmed the financial findings. Alexandra announced that North Star was withdrawing from the original acquisition structure, but proposed an alternative: a targeted purchase of the aircraft, facilities, and employee contracts that had passed clean inspection, paid directly to the company's legitimate creditors, with no proceeds flowing through Graham. The company Graham had retained to provide a competing offer withdrew when their legal team reviewed the preliminary audit output and estimated the contingent liabilities at a figure that made the transaction economically indefensible. The minority shareholders voted to remove Graham from his executive role by a margin of 7-1. Graham still held sufficient equity to block the restructuring proposal. He announced his intention to use that blocking position. It was the last significant decision he made as a Caldwell shareholder. Miranda had spent the previous 36 hours going through the original corporate documents, not looking for anything in particular, but reading carefully because reading carefully was the only thing she knew how to do with a problem she did not yet fully understand. She found it in the founding agreement, in a clause that had been written by the attorney who incorporated Caldwell Aviation 11 years earlier. If a controlling officer used company assets to collateralize personal debt without shareholder authorization, the creditors holding that collateralized debt acquired voting rights equivalent to the collateralized value until the debt was retired or the collateral was released. Graham had used fleet assets worth approximately $19 million to secure his personal loans. The banks holding those loans had not, until that morning, understood the significance of the collateral structure. When North Star's legal team explained it to them, with the relevant clause attached, the banks exercised the voting rights they had held without knowing it. Graham's blocking position dissolved. The restructuring proceeded. North Star acquired 19 aircraft from the Caldwell fleet, the 19 that had passed full inspection under the corrected maintenance standards. The remaining aircraft were either repaired to compliance at Caldwell's expense, under a monitor's supervision, or removed from service. 207 employees were offered positions within the expanded North Star network. The maintenance facilities in Brighton Falls and the two adjacent counties were retained and reclassified as regional service centers under the new division. The component supplier was reported to the relevant certification authority, and its approvals were suspended pending investigation. The personal loans were paid from Graham's equity proceeds, which were substantially diminished by the liability adjustments the auditors had required. Graham received no sale bonus. The clause that would have triggered it required a clean acquisition. The acquisition was not clean, and the adjustment was documented in the final closing statement. Graham was referred to the relevant financial oversight body for investigation of the loan disclosure violations. The maintenance record falsification was referred to the Aviation Safety Authority. Graham had not, in the end, been undone by a reunion. He had been undone by 8 months of documented decisions that he had made believing the documentation would remain in files that no one would examine. Alexandra asked Dylan, in the car outside the facility the evening the closing documents were signed, whether he had any regret about going to the reunion. Dylan said the reunion had not told him anything about himself. It had told him something about the distance between how people behaved when they believed they had an audience that was paying attention and how they behaved when they thought the person they were dealing with had no power to respond. He said this without bitterness and without the satisfaction of someone who had wanted the outcome. He said it the way a person says something they observed and found worth noting. Alexandra said she would see him in the morning for the division review. Dylan said he would be in the hangar. A year later, the maintenance facility in Brighton Falls operated under the name North Star Brighton Division, and the sign above the entrance was the same dimensions as the old Caldwell sign but a different color, which was the only visible evidence that anything had changed for a person driving past on the county road. Caleb Stroud ran the maintenance operations with an attention to documentation that had become something close to a personal philosophy after the events of the previous year. Miranda worked the financial and compliance function for the regional network from an office down the hall, and she had the reputation among the newer employees of someone who would ask any question twice if the answer the first time had contained a phrase that felt like an approximation. Marissa organized a small fundraiser for the technical education program at the high school, and she was careful to describe it as a gathering rather than a reunion, and there were no tables arranged by achievement, and no microphone segment devoted to the narration of professional accomplishments. Dylan came in the same work jacket he had worn the year before. No one laughed, and the absence of laughter did not feel like an achievement. It felt like the correct temperature of a room where no one had decided to make it colder. Sadie was with him, and together they presented the scholarship endowment to the school's technical department. The Rebecca Rowe Engineering Fund, established to support students who were working paid jobs while completing their coursework, without preference for the type of job, and without the expectation that the work would stop while the education was in progress. The fund had been established in the year following Rebecca's death, and this was its fifth presentation cycle, and Dylan had never spoken about it publicly before, which was why several people in the room, including some who had attended the previous year's reunion, were learning for the first time that it existed. A classmate named Daniel approached Dylan near the end of the evening and said that he had been at the table nearest the door the previous year when Graham had offered to pay Dylan's dinner bill, and that he had laughed at the time, and that he wanted to say he understood now that the laughter had been a choice, even if it had not felt like one, and that he was sorry. Dylan said that the apology was worth something and that he received it. He said that the most useful thing Daniel could do with that understanding was apply it the next time he was in a room where someone was being treated as though their work made them smaller rather than larger, and that it was easier to do that the second time than the first. Alexandra arrived late. Having come directly from the airport, where North Star's quarterly flight operations review had run long because of questions about the new turbine inspection protocol that the Brighton division had developed from Dylan's vibration data, she did not call Dylan boss when she reached him. She called him by his name, and she asked whether the engine they had pulled from the third aircraft in the morning's inspection rotation had been cleared for return to service. Dylan said he had not signed it off yet. She asked why. He said he wanted to listen to it run one more time before he signed his name to the paper. Alexandra smiled, not at the professional caution, though she respected that too, but at the consistency of it, at the fact that the person who controlled more than 60% of a company operating across 17 states still believed, without performance and without apology, that the difference between a machine that was ready and a machine that needed one more hour of attention was a difference worth an hour of his time. She set her folder on a table and went to find a cup of coffee. Dylan walked out through the side entrance and drove to the hangar. The engine was in the test bay, mounted on the run stand, and he stood beside it in the quiet of the building and listened to it complete 2 full cycles, at idle before advancing the throttle to the range where the harmonic he was listening for would appear if it was there. It was not there. He listened for another 4 minutes anyway, because 4 minutes was the minimum he trusted, and then he signed the release form and dated it and placed it in the file. 20 years earlier, the people he had grown up beside had looked at the grease on his hands and read it as evidence of a life that had not gone anywhere. They had been reading the wrong document. The grease was not the evidence of where he had ended up. It was the method by which he had built everything that mattered. The same method his wife had understood and his daughter was learning, and his employees practiced every day in facilities that now bore a different name above the door. He turned off the light in the test bay and walked to his truck and drove home through the Ohio dark, past the fields and the quiet roads and the airport, where a row of lights marked the runway he had worked beside for most of his adult life, and where tomorrow morning he would be back before the sun came up, because the work continued and the work was the point, and he had never needed anyone to tell him otherwise. 20 years ago they had mocked the grease on his hands. Now those same hands had built a company, saved 200 jobs, and kept a counterfeit engine from ever leaving the ground. Dylan Rowe did not need to be called boss. He only needed to know he had never become the kind of person who had to push someone else down in order to feel tall.